Out. 6 years, more than $1 million, 11 specialists flown in from London, Hamburg, New York, and twice from Vienna, and the piano her father left her still sat in the corner of the workshop like a beautiful animal that had decided, for reasons no one could name, to stop breathing. It made sound when you struck the keys, technically, but it did not sing. Every restorer who touched it left baffled, sometimes humiliated, and always richer. Out. So on a gray Thursday in late October, when Eleanor Hartley finally reached the end of something she had been carrying for far too long, she turned away from the man in the $3,000 coat, who had just told her to sell it, looked across the room at the maintenance contractor coiling a mop cord by the freight door and said, "What about you? Do you want to try, or are you going to tell me it's perfect like everyone else?" Nobody in that room understood what she had just set in motion. Out. Stay with this one. The truth inside that piano is not what anyone standing there expected, and it isn't what you're expecting either. Out. Marchmont Fine Instruments sat in a converted hosiery factory off DuPont Street in Toronto. 3 stories of old brick that the owners had gutted and rebuilt into something closer to a surgical theater than a shop. The floors were poured concrete, sealed and polished until they threw the light back up at the high windows. Out. The air smelled of hide glue and shellac, and the particular dryness of a room kept at a constant 45% humidity, because the instruments that came here were worth more than the building, and the building was worth a great deal. People did not bring their pianos to Marchmont to have them fixed. They brought them the way you bring a relative to a specialist when the local doctors have run out of ideas. Out. Eleanor came every Monday, not to instruct anyone, not to check on progress that never came, but to stand for a few minutes beside the instrument in Bay 3 and feel whatever it was she felt before she put it away again and went back to running her life. She was 43. Out. She ran Hartley Whitfield, an architecture and heritage practice with offices on King Street, and a reputation that opened doors across the country, and in almost every room she walked into she was the person who saw the problem first and the solution second and left having made the decision everyone else had been circling. She did not lose. She did not let things outlast her attention. Out. That was the engine of her whole life, and it had built everything she had except for the one thing parked under a fitted gray cover in a workshop she did not own. Out. The piano was a concert grand, a 1953 instrument finished in figured walnuts so dark it read almost black until the light caught the grain and the wood seemed to move. Her father had owned it for as long as she'd been alive. It had stood in the front room of the house in Forest Hill through her entire childhood, lid down, never played, dusted weekly by a housekeeper who treated it like furniture because that was the only way anyone in that house was permitted to treat it. Out. Her father had died 6 years ago, in February, and the piano had come to her along with the house and the firm's controlling shares and 1,000 other things she knew how to manage. The piano she did not know how to manage. So she'd had it moved to Marchmont, where the best people in the world could be hired, and she had hired them one after another, year after year, and the piano had defeated every single one. Out. The file on it was thick as a phone book. Eleanor had read all of it. Gordon Pike, the senior restorer at Marchmont, had been first. Pike was 49, silver at the temples, the kind of man who wore his credentials the way other men wear watches, and when he'd first examined the instrument he had spoken with the breezy certainty of someone who expected to be done by Friday. He was not done by Friday. He was not done in 3 months. Out. He restrung it, replaced the hammers with hand-voiced replacements from a maker in Bavaria, reconditioned the action, re-leathered, regulated, and at the end produced a piano that did everything a piano is supposed to do and produced no music at all. The tone was flat, boxed in, muffled, as though someone had draped a wool blanket over the strings that no one could see or remove. Every note was correct. The whole was dead. Out. After Pike came the others, a celebrated technician from a New York concert hall who lasted 8 days and left a 4-page letter that essentially said the instrument should not behave this way, and he could not explain why it did. 2 Viennese rebuilders who arrived together, charged a fortune, replaced the soundboard's entire system of bridges and ribs after weeks of measurement, and departed having made a perfect repair to a piano that had never been broken. Out. A bridge and soundboard specialist from Hamburg, an acoustic consultant who came with a laptop full of frequency analysis and went home unsettled, and then Reinhard Vogel. Out. Vogel was the largest line in the ledger and the last real hope. Eleanor had flown to Vienna to meet him on the recommendation of 2 separate people in the rarefied world of historic instruments, both of whom said the same thing: if Vogel can't, no one can. He was in his late 50s, soft-spoken, genuinely great, and he had spent 4 months at Marchmont with an assistant and a set of tools that traveled in their own padded cases. Out. At the end of 4 months, he submitted a report 40 pages long, dense with measurement and cross-reference, and the conclusion took up a single short paragraph that, read plainly, admitted he did not understand what he was looking at. His invoice came to a little under $300,000. The total across 6 years sat just shy of $1.25 million. Out. And the maddening part, the part that kept Eleanor awake some nights, was that every one of them reached the identical conclusion. The instrument was flawless: soundboards, bridges sound, strings, scale, action, dampers, pin block, all sound, all correct, all to specification and beyond. There was nothing wrong with the piano, it simply would not sing. It was as if it had made up its mind about something a long time ago and no amount of money or talent could talk it out of the decision. Out. Pike's most recent theory, offered in the tone of a man more interested in protecting his reputation than solving anything, was that there might be some buried defect in the original casting of the plate, some flaw that interfered with energy transfer in a way that defied instrumentation. He admitted in the same sentence that this made no real physical sense. The theory existed because he needed a sentence. Eleanor had stopped listening to his sentences 18 months earlier. Out. What stayed with her instead was a stranger feeling, one she would not have said out loud to anyone at the firm, that every person who had touched the instrument had been asking it the wrong question. That the answer was inside it the whole time, patient and unmoving, waiting for someone willing to be quiet long enough to hear it. Out. Vincent Arsenault had been at Marchmont for 4 months when the thing finally cracked open. He'd been brought on through a facilities staffing agency to handle maintenance, cleaning, and minor building repairs, and his intake paperwork listed a general labor history and an address out in the East End where people did not generally land careers in the restoration of million-dollar instruments. Out. He was 39, lean with a quiet, closed face that gave nothing away and a way of moving through a busy room without seeming to displace any air. He wore the dark work shirt the building required of its maintenance staff. He showed up on time. He did his work and went home, and by the end of his first month no one at Marchmont had had a real conversation with him because he did not invite one. Out. What gave him away, if anyone had been paying attention, was his hands. They were not the hands of a man who spent his days pushing a mop. The calluses were in the wrong places, or rather in very particular places. The pads below the fingers, the side of the thumb, the precise points that come from decades of fine work with small tools under tension. Out. There was a permanent thin line of something dark worked into the creases of his knuckles that no soap had ever fully lifted, the kind of mark that comes from years of contact with graphite and felt and the inside of an instrument's action. Maeve Donnelly, the studio coordinator who ran the front of the shop, had noticed it early and said nothing, because people came with histories that were not hers to open. Out. What Maeve had noticed more recently was the way Vincent behaved around the Grand in Bay 3. It wasn't obvious, nothing about him was obvious, but it was consistent. Whenever his cleaning route brought him along that wall, he slowed for just a beat longer than the work required, not staring, not lingering in any way you could point to, just a small stillness, and then he moved on. And the angle of his attention was wrong, or wrong for a mop. Out. He didn't look at the case the way visitors did, drawn to that gorgeous walnut. He crouched and looked underneath, at the beam structure, at the join where the rim met the keybed, at the pedal trap work down in the shadows. He looked at the places that only matter to someone thinking about how the thing was built rather than how it looked. Out. 2 weeks before everything turned, Pike had left an old engineering drawing on his bench, a cutaway of a 1950s Grand Action pulled from the reference library. Vincent, clearing the bench to wipe it down, picked the drawing up to set it aside, and held it for a moment before he put it back. Maeve happened to be watching from across the room, and afterward she could not have explained why the moment stuck with her. The drawing had been lying face down and upside down. Out. Vincent turned it the right way up without appearing to think about it, the way you'd write a book or a photograph, a correction so automatic it meant the orientation was as familiar to him as reading. Then he set it down and went back to the floor. Out. He had come to Toronto from Montreal 8 months before. What he had been doing in Montreal and before that in Hamburg, and what had brought a man with hands like his to a maintenance contract in a city where no one knew his name. These were questions no one at Marchmont had thought to ask. His file held a work record, 2 clean references that checked out, and nothing else. The agency hadn't dug. Pike hadn't wondered. Eleanor had never so much as been introduced to him. Out. In another world, though, if you knew where to listen, the name still moved through a small, careful circle of people who met lives restoring great instruments. It was spoken quietly, not often, but with a particular weight, the kind that attaches to a name people connect to something remarkable that ended badly. The ones who had worked beside him told the story one way. The ones who had worked above him told it another. Out. Both groups, coming from opposite directions, agreed on a single point, that he had been one of the best they ever saw. None of that was known on Dupont Street. Vincent swept the floors and changed the ballasts in the overhead lights and emptied the bins, and the piano sat in Bay 3, and 6 years quietly became 6 years and 4 months. Out. The afternoon it broke open was a Thursday in late October, the first genuinely cold day of the year, the kind where the wind off the lake finds its way into a building no matter how well it's sealed. Vogel had called Eleanor at 2 o'clock on a video line, and the call ran 11 minutes. He had not called with progress. Out. He had called because his professional conscience required him to say plainly what he had come to believe, which was that the problem lived somewhere outside the territory of everything he knew. He was too proud and too careful to use the word impossible. But the sentence he chose came close enough that Eleanor felt the floor tilt slightly under her as she heard it. Out. She ended the call, set her phone on the bench beside the Grand, and stood very still for a while as the cold light came down through the high windows and lay across the walnut, and the wood for once looked not deep but merely dark. Out. Gordon Pike came in from the back. He'd have said he came to check on a delivery, but his timing was not an accident. He knew about the call. He stood beside her a moment looking at the piano, and then said the thing he'd been building toward for the better part of a year. The instrument had a market value, even silent, that put it well above 7 figures at the right auction. There were collectors who would pay for the maker and the provenance alone, who would never once try to play it. Out. Sometimes, he said in the warm, reasonable tone that made it so much worse, the wisest thing a person can do is recognize when to let go. Out. Eleanor did not look at him. She held her eyes on the instrument for another beat. Then she lifted her gaze and looked past him, across the open shop, and there was Vincent by the freight door, winding the cord of a mop around its handle, getting ready to move on to the next thing the way he always did. What happened next was not calculated, and Eleanor was, in nearly every hour of her life, a calculated woman. What happened in the following 30 seconds was none of that. Out. It was 6 years of invoices and apologies and brilliant men shrugging, all of it compressing into one ungoverned moment, the kind that arrives when the distance between what a person can control and what a person actually feels finally closes all the way. She turned to Pike and said, 6 years, more than $1 million. And you're telling me to sell it. Then she pointed across the room. What about you? Do you want to try, or are you going to tell me it's perfect like everyone else? Out. The shop went quiet. Maeve at the front desk stopped what she was doing. Something moved across Pike's face, brief and complicated, before it settled into a thin smile that managed to say this is beneath comment without his having to say it. Vincent set the mop against the wall. He looked at Eleanor, not with deference and not with offense, but with a flat, steady attention, like someone who had already decided what he was going to say. Out. 2 days, he said. I work alone after hours and I want the shop empty. No money up front. If it doesn't sing when I'm finished, you owe me nothing. Out. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment and then, without fully understanding why, she said yes. Out. He started that night at 7. He asked for the shop to be cleared, not because he needed the secrecy, but because he needed the silence. And Pike left with visible reluctance, his footsteps slow and deliberate in the way of a man performing an exit for an audience that wasn't really watching. Maeve shut off the front lights and let herself out the side. Out. Eleanor stayed up in the mezzanine office with the building's security feed open on her monitor, watching without watching, the way you can't quite leave a procedure you don't understand. Out. For the first half hour he didn't touch the piano. He pulled a stool to a spot about 3 meters in front of it and sat down and looked at it. Not analyzing exactly, more like waiting for it to tell him where to start. Then he stood, walked a slow circle around it twice, and stopped at the base end. He crouched, set his ear close to the rim without quite touching it, and rapped the case once with a knuckle. He listened. He moved a hand's width along and did it again. Out. He went under the instrument and lay on his back on the cold concrete for a long time with a small flashlight in his teeth, studying the trapwork and the underside of the soundboard, the levers and dowels that the pedals moved. He was not following any protocol Eleanor had ever watched a specialist follow. He moved the way a person moves through a language they know well but haven't spoken in years. Carefully, without hurry, following something only he could see. Out. He took a small notebook out of his shirt pocket, not a tablet, not a phone, a beaten paper notebook already half full, and he added to it steadily as the hours went by, in a hand so small and even it might have been printed. Out. By the time Friday morning came and Pike let himself in through the side door earlier than necessary, arriving to observe, which is to say arriving to be present for the failure, Vincent had removed a small assembly from deep in the pedal trapwork and set it on a cloth on the bench. Out. It was a piece of brass and steel and felt about the size of a fist, plain to the eye, sitting in a position none of the 11 specialists had given a second look in 6 years, because it was not part of the design they'd come to fix. Pike looked at it, then at Vincent. Out. That's the sostenuto trap, Pike said. You disturb the regulation on that and you'll throw off the entire damper line. You'll be a week putting it right. Out. Vincent did not look up from the action he was studying. It isn't a sostenuto trap, he said, and this is exactly where I need to be. Out. Pike stood there another moment, then went to the back of the shop and made himself busy with something that didn't matter. Out. Maeve came in at 9 with 2 coffees from the place on the corner and set one down beside the open notebook on the edge of the bench. She read, without meaning to, 2 lines that were facing up. One was a column of measurements written in that tiny even hand. The other was a single sentence in the margin added later in slightly different ink in a mix of English and French. The instrument is not broken. No one has asked it the right question. Out. Maeve set the coffee down and said nothing to anyone, but she thought about that line for the rest of the day. Out. By Friday afternoon, the quality of Vincent's movement had changed. He had stopped searching and started confirming. He sat for a long stretch in front of the open action, completely still, with the look of a man who has reached the end of a problem and is taking a last quiet moment to be certain of what he already knows. Then he asked Maeve to tell Eleanor he needed to speak with her alone the next morning. Out. Eleanor came down at 8 on Saturday in a dark coat, her face composed in the careful way it always was when she was bracing for something she couldn't predict. Pike was at the shop entrance. She paused in the doorway and looked at him with a stillness that he correctly understood to mean not you, not this time, and he stayed outside. Out. Vincent had laid 3 things out on the bench beside the grand. The first was the small brass and steel assembly he'd taken from the trapwork, now cleaned and set on its own cloth so its structure was plain. The second was the notebook, open to a page. The third was a photograph. It was black and white, small, the corners gone soft, printed on the heavier paper of an older decade. Out. He had found it folded inside a slit in the felt lining of the keybed, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, pressed into a seam that hadn't been opened since whoever last knew it was there had put it back. He set it in front of Eleanor without saying anything first. Out. The photograph showed a young man standing beside this piano, the same instrument you could tell by a particular flaw in the figure of the walnut near the bass corner, a small, unrepeatable swirl in the grain. He stood at what looked like a recital hall, light coming in from somewhere to his left, and along the bottom, in fountain pen, in a hand Eleanor did not recognize, and then slowly almost did. Pour toi, toujours. Écoute bien. Montréal, Mars 1953. For you always. Listen well. Out. The young man in the photograph was her father, younger than she had ever seen him, younger than any picture that hung in the house, standing beside that piano with an expression she had never once witnessed on his face in 30 years of being his daughter. Not pride. Something further in than pride. Something that looked across all those decades and from this angle like a man standing at the exact center of his own life. Out. Eleanor did not move for a long time. When she finally looked up, Vincent began to explain, in the manner of a man who had spent a great while deciding precisely what to say and had committed to saying only what was true. Out. The piano had never had a fault. Not one, not ever. The reason it would not sing was not a defect, not a hidden flaw, not a failure in the casting or the board. It was a mechanism, a device built by hand and installed after the instrument left the maker, fitted into the trapwork by a craftsman working privately with no documentation anywhere. It did not appear in any record. It could not be found by any standard diagnostic because it did not behave like damage. It behaved like an instruction. Out. Down in the trap, concealed and beautifully made, sat a sustain lock, a felted bar that rested against the soundboard's main bridge under light spring tension, killing the instrument's resonance without affecting a single note's action. Every key worked. Every hammer struck true, and the whole voice of the thing stayed pressed flat, as though under a hand, until the lock was released. Out. And the lock could only be released by a specific sequence of physical actions, a combination known to no one but the man who built it and whoever that man had chosen to tell. Out. Vincent pointed to the small assembly on the cloth. This is the release, he said. Not a switch, not a latch, a sequence. Every person who worked on this came here to look at the board, the strings, the action, because those are the parts that fail. None of them came down here, because down here nothing is broken. It isn't broken. It was built this way on purpose by someone who knew exactly what he was doing and meant for it to stay that way until the right person came. Out. Eleanor asked the question she'd been holding since he started. How do you know all this? Out. Vincent paused. It was the first hesitation she had seen from him in 2 days. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite feeling and wasn't quite the absence of it. Because I knew the man who built it, he said. He was my teacher. Out. The shop was dead quiet. Out front, Pike had drifted closer to the door, and Eleanor could see through the frosted glass that he had been standing there listening. She let it be, for now. Pike pushed the door open and came in and looked at Vincent with the particular flatness of a man whose authority has just been quietly stepped past by someone he had never thought to consider a threat. Out. That's a moving story, Pike said, but you still haven't made it sing. Out. Vincent looked at him for exactly as long as it took to let the sentence stand on its own weight, and not 1 second longer. Then he turned back to Eleanor. "I need 1 more day," he said, "and I need you here when I finish." Out. Pike made a phone call that afternoon to Reinhard Vogel. He framed it as a courtesy, informing the recently retained specialist of a development. What it actually was, and what Pike understood it to be, somewhere he preferred not to look, was an attempt to gather a room of credentialed witnesses ahead of an outcome he could neither take credit for nor wave away. Vogel arrived the next morning without his assistant, without his cases, and without the optimism of his first visit. Out. He listened while Pike summarized the claim. His face stayed even and neutral the whole time, the trained blankness of a man who has learned never to predict. When Pike finished, Vogel was quiet for a moment. Then he asked simply where Vincent was. Out. Vincent was in the shop, where he'd been most of the night. Maeve had brought food down at 11 the evening before. He'd thanked her in the brief, half-their way of someone whose attention is too fully occupied to surface for courtesy, and she had left the plate and gone home. Out. Eleanor had not slept much either. She lay in the mezzanine with her phone on her chest and the ceiling above her, thinking about the photograph, about the French in the corner, about her father's face in 1953. After midnight, she made a call to Edmund Frears, who had been her father's lawyer for almost 30 years and was very likely the last living person who might know anything about the parts of her father's life he had never described. The call was short. Out. When it ended, she lay still for a long time without moving. Out. She had asked Frears one question, finally the one she had never had a reason to ask before. Did my father play? And Frears, an old man who had kept a great many confidences and was tired of keeping this one, told her what almost no one alive still knew. Her father had been, as a young man in Montreal, a pianist of real promise, a student of a maker and teacher named Léon Charbonneau, a recitalist people had expected things from. He had met Eleanor's mother at a concert. Out. They had married within the year, and he had stopped completely and forever in the winter Eleanor's mother died, when Eleanor was 4 and could not now remember the sound of any of it. He had Charbonneau seal the instrument's voice that same winter. Not destroy it, not sell it. Out. Seal it with a lock only Charbonneau knew how to make, so that it would stand silent in his front room for the rest of his life, and could, someday in the right hands, with patience no one in a hurry would ever have, be made to sing again. Out. Vincent came to the door of the mezzanine office at 11 on Sunday morning. He looked like a man who had worked 3 days on almost no sleep, and had not yet decided whether it had been worth it, but his eyes were perfectly clear. "Are you ready?" he said. She had been ready since 2 in the morning, though she would never have put it that way. Out. They came down together. Pike was already there, standing near the keyboard with his arms folded in the manner of a man holding 2 different speeches and waiting to learn which the situation would call for. Vogel stood off by the side door, apart, his face arranged into that careful neutrality. Maeve stood near the bench, holding nothing, watching everything. Out. Vincent lifted the lid and set it on the long stick. He sat down at the keyboard, and what he did next was not what anyone in that room was braced for. He did not begin to play. He set his right foot on the sustain pedal and held it down. He reached his left hand inside, past the dampers to a point along the bass strings, and pressed once, lightly with 2 fingers, in a place that meant nothing to anyone watching. He brought his hand back. Out. He played very quietly 4 notes, the opening of something, a small rising phrase, almost nothing, and on the 4th he pushed the pedal and held all 3 pedals down together for a slow count. Somewhere down in the trapwork there was a sound so small it was barely a sound at all, a single soft release like a held breath let go. Out. Then he lifted his hands, set them properly on the keys, and played the phrase again. Out. The piano bloomed. Out. There is no better word for what came out of that instrument. It did not warm up or ease into it. The first chord opened in the room like something physical, full and round and absurdly alive. A tone with a body to it, with a low end, you could feel in the concrete under your feet, and a top that hung shimmering in the cold air long after his hands had moved on. It filled the whole shop, rolled off the brick and the high glass, and came back double. Out. After 6 years of that boxed, blanketed, dying sound, the difference was not an improvement. It was a resurrection. It was Eleanor understood all at once and completely, exactly the thing her father had once described to her mother and never described to anyone again. Less like a machine, more like a voice. Out. And the phrase Vincent was playing, she knew it. Not from anywhere she could place, but from somewhere far older than memory, from a room she'd been too young to keep. It was the thing her mother used to play. The lock had been built around it. To wake the instrument you had to know how it began. Out. Eleanor took 2 steps forward before she knew she'd moved. She stopped at the bass curve of the instrument and put her hand flat on the rim, on the walnut, where the wood was humming under her palm, and she closed her eyes and stood like that while the sound went on around her, No one spoke. Maeve had pressed her fingers together at her sides. Even Pike, for a moment, was perfectly still. Vogel had turned his face slightly away, toward the windows, the way a person does when they need a second. Out. Vincent let the phrase resolve and lifted his hands, and the last of it rang out and faded, and the room was quiet in a way it had never once been quiet in 6 years. Not the silence of something that couldn't answer, but the silence of something that finally had. Out. Pike spoke first. His voice was steady in the way voices are steady when they're covering something less steady underneath. That sequence, he said, there's no record of it, anywhere. Where did it come from? Out. From the man who built it, Vincent said. Out. And who was that? Out. Someone who didn't want it written down. Out. Pike held his position a moment longer, then shifted to the question he'd been circling all morning. Then let me ask you a simpler one. Who exactly are you? Out. Vincent looked at Vogel before he answered, and held his eyes for a measured beat. You ran the assessment on the Bosendorfer collection in Salzburg in 2011, he said. I was the lead on the restoration. My name used to be on it. Out. Something moved through Vogel's face, brief, involuntary, impossible to fully hide. His mouth opened a little and closed again. Out. Vincent turned to Eleanor. He told it plainly, without performance, in the tone of a man discharging something he'd carried too long. He had spent 14 years restoring historic instruments at the highest level, Montreal, then Hamburg, then everywhere the great collections were. Out. Léon Charbonneau had been his first teacher back in Montreal, the most gifted maker he'd met in 14 years among gifted makers, and in his entire life, Charbonneau had built that sustain lock exactly once, for one man, for one piano. The young man beside the instrument in the photograph, the one whose face Eleanor had never seen, had been Charbonneau's friend and student. Out. Charbonneau had told Vincent the whole story years ago. The pianist who stopped, the piano he could not bear to hear and could not bear to silence forever, the lock built so that grief would have a door in it. Vincent had not known the man's name. He had not known the instrument was in Toronto. And then he'd walked into Marchmont his first week and seen it in Bay 3 and known the maker's hand the way you know the handwriting of the person who taught you to write. Out. What happened to him? Eleanor asked. Your teacher. Out. He died 9 years ago, Vincent said. I was the only one he told. Out. Eleanor was very still. Frears's phone call from the night before was sitting in her chest like a weight finding its place, and she understood with the exact certainty of a fact arriving precisely where it was always meant to land, what the whole of it meant. She did not say it out loud. Not yet. Out. Pike tried once more. If you're who you say you are, he said, gesturing at the workshirt, at the mop by the door, at everything the question implied, what are you doing here? Out. The question was meant to diminish him, and it did the opposite. It hung in the cold air of the shop like a statement about the man asking it, the loudest thing in the room and the least useful. Vincent looked at him just long enough and then turned back to Eleanor. Out. He told her the rest in the small office at the back of the shop, the two of them alone, the grand visible through the interior window, silent now in a completely different way than it had been silent for 6 years. 4 years ago, doing authentication work for a European house that dealt in historic instruments, he had found documentation that didn't add up. Provenance records that had been fabricated, instruments sold as confirmed originals on histories that were invented. Out. The money involved ran to 7 figures several times over across years. He'd reported it internally first. The report was read, acknowledged, and quietly buried. He filed a second, more formal. Within a month, he was let go on grounds that were technically procedural and practically untraceable. Out. Within 2 months, his name had been scrubbed from the documentation of nearly every restoration he'd led in 14 years. Papers reassigned, certifications relabeled, his work handed quietly to other names. He did not sue. Someone who understood how these things resolve had told him the fight would cost him everything he had and recover nothing. I didn't lose my career because I was wrong, he said. I lost it because I was right. Out. He'd come to Toronto because he needed to be somewhere his name carried no weight at all. The maintenance contract was not a punishment and not a disguise. It was what was available and asked nothing of him he wasn't willing to give. He had not planned for the piano, and once he'd seen it, he had made no plan beyond staying and waiting for the moment to announce itself. He had not gone to Eleanor. He had not said who he was. Out. He had done his work and stayed in the room and let the thing come to him in its own time, because, and here he said the part she most needed to hear, I wanted to know whether the instrument deserved the person who'd kept it, before I decided what to do. He had watched her come every Monday for 4 months and stand beside a silent piano she could not have explained to anyone, and that, in the end, was the only credential that had ever mattered to him. Out. Pike submitted his resignation by email that same afternoon, in careful, professional language that said nothing true. Eleanor read it once, forwarded it to the agency, and did not reply. Vogel's leaving was a different and far more honest thing. He found Vincent in the shop late in the day, putting tools back where they belonged, and he stopped a short way off and stood in the specific silence of a man who has something to say and isn't sure he's earned the right to say it. Out. Then he said it, quietly in German without an audience. He had seen the Salzburg records years ago. He had been told at the time that Vincent left of his own accord. He had not pushed because pushing was not his habit, and he had carried a low, unnamed discomfort about that for years without locating its source until this morning. He put out his hand. Vincent took it. Nothing else passed between them. Vogel walked out the front and did not come back. Out. A week later, Eleanor had the instrument moved. Not to the firm, not to a gallery, but home, to the front room in Forest Hill where it had stood silent through her entire childhood, into the same square of floor where it had always been. She gave instructions that the complete record of the mechanism, every measurement and every step of the release that Vincent had written in that small notebook, be sealed in the instrument's private file, available by her authorization alone. Out. The lock itself she had Vincent leave exactly as Charbonneau had built it. The photograph went back into the felt of the keybed, wrapped in its oilcloth, pressed into the same seam because some things were meant to stay precisely where they were. Out. On the first evening it stood in that room, she sat down at it herself, though she did not play and had never learned. She set her hand on the keys the way you set your hand on the shoulder of someone you have finally understood too late and not too late at once. Out. Outside the window the maples on the street had gone bare, and the first hard cold had come down over the city, and the room was warm and the instrument was awake. And somewhere underneath all of it a four-note phrase she could not consciously remember was waiting, the way it had waited her whole life, for someone patient enough to ask it the right way. Out. Vincent had a new title by then, one Eleanor had more or less invented for him on the spot in the back office of the shop, because there was no existing name for what she wanted him to do. Keeper of Significant Works. The job as she'd described it was to make sure that things of genuine value did not vanish simply because no one had been patient enough to understand them. Out. She'd paused after she said it and admitted she wasn't certain whether that was a job description or a different kind of statement. He had looked at her with that same level attention and asked whether she was offering or asking. Both, she'd said. Out. And for the first time since the cold morning 4 months earlier when he had walked into Marchmont in a dark work shirt, carrying everything no one had thought to ask about, Vincent Arsenault smiled. Not a careful smile held at the right distance, but the smile of a man who has set something down after carrying it a long way, and found, in the setting down, that his hands were still good for the work. Out. What stays with me every time I turn this story over is how long that piano sat in plain sight while the smartest people in the room kept looking at the wrong thing. 11 specialists, more than $1 million. 6 years of measuring a soundboard that was never the problem. And the answer was waiting down in the trapwork the whole time. The way answers usually wait, quietly, patiently, for somebody willing to stop performing and actually listen. Out. I think about Vincent Arsenault sitting on that stool for half an hour before he touched a single key, and I think that's the part most of us skip. We want to act, we want to look capable, we rush in with our tools and our theories because sitting still feels like doing nothing. But he understood something the experts didn't. You can't fix what you refuse to understand first. The quiet wasn't laziness, it was the work. Out. Real understanding takes a kind of patience that doesn't photograph well and never makes anyone look impressive in the moment. Out. And here's the thing that changed everything, the thing the money couldn't buy. Vincent didn't reveal who he was the first week. He watched Eleanor come every Monday and stand beside a silent instrument she couldn't explain, and he waited to see whether she deserved what she was keeping. That restraint came from somewhere deeper than skill. He'd been broken once, stripped of his name, his career, his record, for the simple crime of telling the truth about a fraud nobody wanted exposed. Out. A lesser man comes out of that bitter. He came out of it honest, and he stayed honest even when honesty cost him everything. That's the part I'd want my own kids to take from this. Talent gets you in the door. Character is what you do once the door's been slammed in your face. Out. I won't pretend the courage was small either. It would have been easier to keep mopping floors and stay invisible. Invisibility was safe. Stepping forward in front of a room full of people who'd already decided he was nobody, that took a steadiness most of us only think we have until we're tested. He didn't have leverage. He had 2 days and a promise that if he failed, he'd walk away with nothing. Out. So when people ask me what the story is really about, I don't say it's about a piano. I say it's about the gap between what a title tells you and what a person actually carries. Eleanor's father locked a voice inside that instrument because grief needed a door, and only the patient, the honest, and the unbroken could ever find it. The rest of us spend our lives walking past doors like that, too busy to knock. Slow down. Out. Be the kind of person who's still standing when it would have been easier to fold. And never ever decide you know who someone is by the uniform they're wearing.